means of obtaining exemptions. In this state, there's been an 8-fold rise in that. So we find that it's the harder it is.
Doctor,
yeah.
Well over 3 minutes, and we need to model the appropriate behaviors for everybody who's following you.
Sure.
Let me start on by asking you a question.
Sure.
You were on a string of thought that talks about the risks inherent by maintaining the existing non-medical exemptions. Could you help us understand briefly precisely what those ramifications are likely to be?
So what we have seen and others have seen is that if you have clusters or non-medical exemptions, you have a higher risk of community level outbreak. I don't subscribe, my approach is that it's not a magic number, and it was discussed, it's not a magic number under which if you have decrease in protection, you start seeing outbreaks, but we do know verifiably that clusters of vaccine refusal are associated with these outbreaks. And we, as a country, barely dodged revocation of our measles elimination status last year. If the New York outbreak had gone on for a few more weeks, we would have been declared an endemic country for measles.
Thank you, Doctor. Are there other questions? Representative Pettis, followed by Senator Rahman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor. I think you may have answered my first question. That one of the common discussion points we have is people come to us and say, how is an unvaccinated child a threat or a danger if they're in a community that's 95% vaccinated?
So there are a few things. That's a really good question. First of all, conceptually, so it's community immunity is a very intuitive process. If in this room we have an introduction of, God forbid, let's say, the novel coronavirus or measles, and if all of us were unprotected, it would infect a certain number of people. And there is a basic probability question that you have group vulnerability. However, if you protect some people, the likelihood that someone sitting next to a susceptible individual goes down. And it keeps on going down until it becomes really difficult or impossible to start an outbreak. So that's the basic question. But we have seen that at the local level, a breakdown of community immunity is associated with outbreaks, actual specific outbreaks, etc. So, and specifically in our work, if we looked at the outbreak curves, if we added up all the plotted the time and the kinds of cases and the reason why people were unvaccinated across time, we found that those who are unvaccinated are disproportionately present at the beginning of these outbreaks, meaning that they provide this pockets of susceptibility that can then wrap up all of the other people as well.
A follow-up to that is another common discussion point is that, well, if you push X children out of the school system and now they're in the community, my kid's going to be exposed to them at the IGA and Cub Scouts and Girl Scouts and Little League and soccer and the synagogue and everywhere else, so you haven't really changed the risk. How would you respond to that conceptualization?
So that's a really good question, and I'll take the liberty of giving examples of two other states that have tried different options. So Washington State added the requirement of a physician counseling provision that they didn't eliminate initially all non-medical exemptions in that state. And that said, look, if you want to have a truly informed decision, go to a healthcare provider licensed in the state and know about, they are by law required to give you information on any potential rare or sort of other side effects, but also explain to you how your child and the community becomes at risk due to your decision. That's true informed consent. But just adding that provision, they had a relative reduction in their exemption rates by over 42%. And they gained approximately a decade in their trend. Washington State used to be one of the highest exemption rate states. So that's one example. In California, often the data are looked at in isolation, medical exemptions, and school opt-out. We did a series of studies, which I'd be happy to share, that looked at the whole picture of the reason why children were not up to date and what happened after these successive things that California did. They did a bunch of things. They had a Washington-type law that started turning the trajectory. They had a crackdown on what is called provisional entrance that was discussed earlier on. You say that I'm going to get my child vaccinated. That was being sort of misused, at least in the context of that provision. They had an education campaign and say that they should not be misused, and then they had elimination of all non-medical exemptions. The early ones had an impact on decreasing non-medical exemptions and increasing the vaccination rates. When they got to the third part, when in the sort of the Goldilocks framework, it was a little too hot in the sense that they went to that option. Unfortunately, we saw that although non-medical exemptions became extinct, there was a concurrent rise in medical exemptions, but medical exemptions were not the biggest reason for that rise. The biggest ones were these two categories where the law didn't apply. For example, homeschooling, independent study programs, and this, Dr. Pettit, you would understand this more intuitively, this diagnosis of exclusion, where there was this category reported by the health department of overdue. And that means that at the local level, the law was kind of not being implemented. It's hard to implement these things. The overall rates did go up, and we didn't model these data through synthetic control or any of that stuff. We looked at the actual data, and what we found was that the rates of vaccinations did go up, but they seemed to be going up due to sort of, for lack of a better term, a crackdown on misuse of the provisional or conditional entrance category. So we don't have that kind of a category here, so there are differences between the two states. So perhaps some people consider that a Goldilocks approach to it, we have to do something about this. We can't sit around and not act in face of a real prospect of a resurgence of a major disease. But we need to learn from the other states as well.
And finally, I think California and Washington have the biggest experiences. What has been the increase in their overall vaccination rates? Is there an absolute number that you can place on both?
Yeah, I don't recall the exact number. I can easily share it with you, but it has been a sort of substantive, reasonable enough, especially for a state heterogeneous as heterogeneous as California, because the overall increase masks these drastic changes in susceptibility due to clustering of exemptions. So we specifically looked at the clustering of not up-to-date children in California, combining all of these categories, and that has been perceptibly, has had substantial impact, especially in Southern California, where clusters of vaccine refusal have been virtually eliminated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Anwar, followed by Senator Summers, followed by Representative Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Omar. I wanted to ask you, we know right now that the World Health Organization is looking at this as a global threat, the vaccine hesitancy or refusal. That's the World Health Organization's report at this time, and right after Ebola, literally. The question is, why is this happening? What is the source of information / misinformation that is out there? Maybe CDC is wrong, maybe everybody else is correct, vice versa. And what are the implications of this? If you could share your thoughts.
So you're right. In 2019, the World Health Organization declared misinformation around vaccines as one of the top 10 threats to global health. And that is not just low-income countries, it's high-income countries as well. So they were specifically talking about North America and Europe when they sort of were focusing on this issue. And there's several sources of it. There are a lot of parents who sincerely believe that they have concerns about vaccines. And then there are those who have their vocation to sort of spread misinformation around vaccines. I'm not going to go into the different categories there. And I believe that individual parents come from the right starting point. It's perfectly reasonable to seek information around vaccines or anything else. Having said that, it is therefore our responsibility to make sure that information is correct. And I have a lot of empathy for represented leaders, because I'm sure you're bombarded with all sorts of information, and they fall into, the researchers have looked into it, that they fall into a few categories. So one is sort of inauthentic, inappropriate expert, how to, not everyone, even with an MD in front of their name, is an expert. So how do you judge who are the experts? Look at the group consensus. Look at the consensus of the Institute of Medicine, which is which is now National Academy of Medicine, part of the the other academies. And if you want to look at that, they simplified it for all of us. They have a website called Vaccines Are Safe. They have looked at it again and again, not individual studies, looked at the totality of evidence, and then have come out vociferously in favor of vaccination. So that's one thing, and that leads me to the second thing, is avoiding cherry picking. A lot of the evidence that comes in front of you is cherry picked. Again, going back to the group scientific consensus is the way to deal with it. Then impossible expectation. So folks will, I'm sure, will come to you, can you guarantee that every last bit of it is known and we are 109% certain that vaccines are absolutely safe in absolutely every instance. We put sometimes a higher bar on this side without recognizing the prospect of these diseases returning is real. Countries like us, Germany and France, etc., have seen national level outbreaks. And then the last thing is outright conspiracy theories. The way to look at it is look at the mainstream evidence. These are the reports from these entities are not written thousands of years ago. These committees and these entities whose information is cherry-picked can be verified by what they're saying now. And the people who wrote this, what they are saying now, they're not long dead, that we are sort of interpreting their deliberations in our present life. So being mindful of the categories of misinformation that is thrown at the general public, including and representatives, is helpful in the sense of public health protection.
Another question I wanted to ask, and I think the commissioner's staff, in my opinion, did not answer that question, was that you have a national vaccine compensation program. Why is that program? Why has that program given so much money to people? Does that reflect the problems with the vaccine and then the complications from the vaccines?
So one principle in public health that underlies a lot of public health thinking is the precautionary principle. And to say that go overboard in terms of precaution, and this is, in terms of vaccines efficacy and the impact that comes into play. But in the 80s, and I would amend what was said by the health department and provide a little bit more context to why the injury compensation program came into being, and what are some of the implications. So it wasn't just it wasn't a thing that a blanket protection of vaccine companies. I'll come back to that specific part. It was the public health imperative was to sustain a stable vaccine supply in this country. Because of litigation, a lot of vaccine companies were pulling out. I don't care if someone's board is not happy with their share price, but what I do care about is the fact that we need to have a stable vaccine supply. The other thing which is true, that vaccines, while are extremely safe, they have rare side effects. And while the risk-benefit ratio heavily favors vaccination, as a fair, just society, it's entirely appropriate to look out for parents who do get real side effects. And do that and help them in a way that they don't have to go through costly litigations, and where lawyers often take advantage of these parents who are worried about their children's health. So to find that balance, this system was created. Which it says is that, look, if you have an adverse event which is in a table created by experts, you have to go through this system first. And there are these special types of judges called special masters who go through the verification. But your burden of proof for going through the system is actually very low. It's the term is often used, 50% in a feather. So you're not going have a higher burden of proof that is often included in other kind of litigation. You don't even have to prove that this specific vaccine caused this specific adverse event in your kid, which is often impossible to establish even for legitimate adverse events. All you have to show is that your kid got vaccinated and your kid has this adverse event, which is a known side effect. So we as a public health system are on the side of caution, say you get compensated. And it is incorrect to say that they cannot sue vaccine companies. It says that if you can't do that directly, you have to go through this system. And then there are avenues for suing vaccine companies if even after going through that. It is another story that these lawsuits have been found without merit or haven't been succeeded after going through the system, but that's a different thing. I'm not a lawyer, and that you may want to ask someone else. So in summary, what this, and the way, since it was the beauty of bipartisan legislation that came out in the 80s at the federal level, there was a mechanism to pay for it. So that the federal government and the taxpayers are not directly bearing the burden. What it does is that in this country, with every antigen of a vaccine sold, there's a small excise duty that says that is enacted on it, and then goes into that fund so that you're never looking for new money for it. And it has, some people sort of share those numbers. The reason why that fund has ballooned is because that vaccines are extremely safe. Even with this low threshold system, we have had millions of dollars in compensation. Even with that, we have substantial resources there. So I apologize for a little bit of a long answer, but since it was discussed, I thought I'd provide some context, which is a beauty of a democratic system that threads the needle between public health protection, but also safeguards those who could have real side effects.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Summers, followed by Representative Michelle. And I'm going to ask some questions.
Thank you, Doctor, for being here. It's nice to see you in person after talking with you on the phone. I had a question. What I'm hearing, or what I think I heard you say, is that we have, or California and Washington had certain pockets of the population that was not vaccinated, where we saw some disease pop up. Would you, or do you believe that what you described as far as having a one-on-one conversation with a clinician to discuss vaccinations, pros and cons, what it means to be vaccinated, not vaccinated, what it means to have your child vaccinated, what that means for other children if your child is not vaccinated, and documented in a real consent form between a clinician and a parent, is that, in your opinion, more effective to be able to educate in those particular pockets to try to increase the immunization rate rather than to be heavy-handed and say, you've got to get these by this date or you're out of school? I talked to some infectious disease clinicians down at Lawrence Memorial Hospital. Some of them have come from other countries, and I'm not anti-vaccine. They've seen diseases that we don't have in this country because of vaccines, but they also framed it really uniquely, and they said human nature has a real sensitivity to requiring the government to mandate something be put into their child. Education is the way to do it, with the real data and the pros and the cons. So I wanted to see what you thought about that. If we can identify the pockets, can we have an ability, or would it be a better plan to have an ability to have a real conversation with a clinician? Because if we exclude certain individuals who are not going to be vaccinated for whatever reason, they're still in the community. So how does that, really help the ultimate goal? Could you speak to that, Rob?
Yeah, I can share some of the data that we have seen from other states, and with some caveats, because there are only a few states. Like we have 50 states, and so we're dealing with small number of examples. But this is all we have to learn from in terms of different experiments. So the Washington example, where they had this kind of requirement, but they had also a few loopholes that I'll come back to, were reduced substantially the vaccine refusal, etc., in that state without the so-called replacement effect. In California, we did see a replacement effect, and you only see that replacement effect if you look at all causes of non-vaccination, because it's like a balloon. You press it from one side, it comes out from the other. So that is the evidence, with the caveat that a couple of other examples are there. West Virginia and Mississippi, where they have the lowest rates of non-vaccination around the country, and they eliminated their non-medical exemptions ages ago. So these are, and New York and Maine are relatively new, and we haven't had data to look at that experience. So with that caveat, this is what these are what the data are pointing towards. Now coming back to, in its own right, physician counseling can be very effective, provided there are a few caveats that are taken care of. First of all, it should be a rule of thumb that not everyone under the sun is added under the category of healthcare provider. And it matters. You know, you as experienced legislators, I'm sure you appreciate that it is the details that often matter. So one of the things is that it should not be a catch-all. Anyone who call themselves a healthcare provider are included in that. A nice rule of thumb is that whoever is allowed by the state to be qualified to give vaccines should be the one who's considered to have the wherewithal and the understanding and the ability to update their knowledge about even side effects, but also benefits as well, should be the one signing these things. The other thing is, so some of it, what I described was real data. Then we projected it out to say what happens if you apply different kinds of policies. And what we found was that if there is a grandfather clause, if there's a grandfather clause, if your desire is to reduce your risk of outbreaks right now, with that grandfathering in, you get the benefit of having high vaccination rates, the full benefit in 6-7 years. You do get it, but because it was really it was pointed out earlier that folks who are already in the system continue to be part of that herd. So if you're going to do that, focus on that part. And the other thing is that another part of complementary legislation that I'm seeing here is innovative, in the sense that in the clinics, a lot of these discussions require a lot of dedication, a lot of attention, and it takes time. And physicians, and especially primary care providers, especially in underserved areas, do all sorts of things, and they get compensated if the conversation leads to vaccination. But you don't know that when you're starting the conversation. And so that should be a billing code that is covered. And coming from Connecticut with its history of innovation in the insurance industry, that would be a signal that could be an example for other states to learn from, for a rational evidence-based approach. The reason I'm calling that an evidence-based approach, that there is a lot of geographic, socioeconomic variability in the reasons of non-vaccination and so on and so forth, and the interventions to address that. There's one constant, be it any state in the US, be it Mexico, be it Kenya, be it South Asia. We have looked at all of these situations. The most trusted source of information, even in this era of WhatsApp, Tinder, all sorts of things. I meant to say Twitter, but either way. But these kinds of things that are out there, misinformation is spreading through these kinds of social media. The most reliable source of information remains a physician. And a physician or a healthcare provider is someone who is most qualified to counsel as well and provide true informed consent. And so if you're empowering that entity by these other sort of accompanying legislative actions, I think that's wonderful.
If I can follow up to that, so if we had true informed consent, I know when I took my kids to the pediatrician, it was simply, oh, it's time for this shot, and the nurse came in and gave me the shot. So there was no conversation. So you're saying one other alternative would to have true informed consent with a physician or a healthcare provider who is qualified to give the vaccine, to have a conversation based on scientific data, pro con, with the parent, and they would be able to be compensated for that time regardless of what the outcome is, whether the patient received the vaccination or not. That would help increase the immunization rate in a way that is different than being heavy-handed.
Yeah, so that would be, if you implemented that would how it would work. But to prevent the abuse of that provision, that you don't have exemption mills sort of running in the state, it should always be accompanied by an informed declination form, which is initialed by the physician and the provider saying that they discuss these real sort of risks, for example, associated with non-vaccination, both for the child and for the community. And the other caveat is this kind of conversation works best, both in terms of the clinic flow, if it is available as an option, but not mandated for every encounter. It would be highly impractical to do that, but if, for example, primary care physicians interact with the parents all the time. And in that dynamic, if they feel that they spend, let's say, 20 minutes of their time counseling them, they should be able to bill for that, without mandating that everyone, starts talking about vaccines at hello.
My last question, on the medical exemption, do you think there should be more leeway on that medical exemption rather than just the boxes from CDC, where a clinician has the ability as a trained expert to have a say in this particular patient meets a criteria that is not one of these boxes, but I feel that they should be exempted, or we should put this particular vaccination at a later time. That's one of the outright complaints that I've heard from citizens that are taking a religious exemption from some.
So I feel strongly in evidence-based medicine. Physicians, as it's implemented in states that have reasonable requirements around medical exemptions, already have leeway. But they need to stick to different guidelines that are consensus-based, and we do that in all sorts of other things. Because otherwise it opens room for abuse of this law. But also, when you're calling something a medical exemption, it should be based on medical reasoning. And it shouldn't be an umbrella for all sorts of other stuff. So they need to, and the mechanisms that are proposed to prevent that kind of, for lack of a better term, abuse, I think are entirely appropriate and needed for that kind of a situation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And just for the benefit of the public, because I know Senator Summers knows this, we do have a provision in the proposed legislation which does provide the practitioner with some leeway to determine medical exemption reasoning that may not be explicitly stated in the CDC guidelines. So that's in the bill. And we have the oversight committee to look at outliers for the potential abuse in either extreme. And I should also add, with regard to Senator Summers' previous question, that everyone should be paying attention to House Bill 5043, which does require insurance companies to provide reimbursements for an extended consultation between practitioners and families to discuss their vaccine options. So again, we try to anticipate those things. I really appreciate Senator Summers' questions because they illuminate aspects of the legislation we're currently considering. Representative Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both of you for coming to testify today. I've received over 1,200 emails in which there are in some of the emails, there are a couple of stories of physicians refusing to help families and tell them to go to somebody else. And so that brings a question, yourself as a physician, are they, or what kind of pressures do physicians get in order to push for vaccines? That would be a first question.
So my perspective is as of a researcher in this, in this context, etc. To set the context, vaccines have overall very high support at the community level, and even mandates, irrespective of what you think. And you go back to sort of the dialogue in Atticus Finch, in To Kill a Mockingbird about your conscience and majority, etc. We do know that there even mandates are highly supported by the population. Having said that, there are a lot of parents who feel, or minority parents or individuals who are sort of overall feels strongly about vaccines. They are very vociferous, and I'm sure I have a lot of empathies with the email traffic that I'm sure you are getting. And so, but coming back to your question, and could you sort of again remind me of the core of the question in terms of
what sort of pressures do the MDs or the physicians to act this way in some of the stories that I've read.
Yeah, so they do face pressures when this kind of a law is enacted, whichever degree it is. And the best way to do that is to empower them through the law that they should stick to the guidelines, the mainstream guidelines. And I went through, not the 5-6 categories of misinformation, but if you empower them to stick to the guidelines, give them the leeway that is already there, but then monitor overall trends, I think that's a reasonable way to go.
But would you consider our language in the bill is going to make sure that physicians will not refuse to help a family that has questions or issues and concerns?
I haven't looked at that specific proposed language. My intuition is that especially primary care physicians are dealing with all sorts of pressure in there. And so there are already sort of reasons for interacting with the family or otherwise, including the fact that they need to safeguard the herd immunity or community protection in their waiting rooms, in their sort of practices, etc. So I don't second guess an individual physician making that decision. Overall, do I wish that the conversation continues with mainstream physicians? That would be my preference. But I don't think it would be a good idea to codify that specific thing into a legislative language. But you guys understand that better. But from my perspective, that would pose an undue burden on physicians who, I guess, all of us want to apply their clinical judgment within the mainstream guidelines.
Right, and I'm not going to perpetuate the question, but one of the part of my question was what kind of pressures, because you confirmed they have pressures.
So yeah, so they're asked to sign, medical exemptions for non-medical reasons. So that's one specific pressure. They are asked. I'm sorry.
The reverse pressure, not the pressure in order to sign medical exemptions, the pressure not to.
At least in that kind of, at least at a mass level, the clinician surveys that are done do not indicate that physicians specifically, at any sizable numbers beyond anecdote and data, beyond individual anecdotes feel any kind of pressures that way. So there have been really wonderful surveys I would encourage people to look at that is run out of University of Colorado. The data I saw there do not sort of seem to indicate that they feel any pressure to not sign medical exemptions when they are warranted.
Okay, and I'll go back to your domain of research.
Last question, Representative Michelle.
Yeah, sure. I could have more, but I'll go with one. What ingredients would be toxic if in higher dose, and can the mix of those ingredients also be toxic? Thank you.
So, look, I can go through sort of a textbook of toxicology and sort of project some, but in the interest of time, I'll sort of condense that. The ingredients that are in our vaccines are evaluated starting with the bench to trials, and it was stated that there are no randomized controlled trials. There are randomized controlled trials. There are also placebo trials for the initial set of vaccines, or if you're introducing a vaccine in a new age group. There are randomized controlled placebo trials there. What happens is when you add to an existing schedule, every mainstream ethicist and the Institute of Medicine has looked into this, would counsel you not to withhold the standard of care, which is the current immunization schedule, from the folks in the control group. And so we don't, that's why what you do is your control group has placebo plus the existing schedule, and your intervention group has the new vaccine. And so therefore, what you do is you do observational studies. And we, meaning the community, has done observational studies applying the up-to-date causality criteria, and the combination of ingredients in the current vaccines haven't shown a signal that would warrant us to withdraw any of that.
Right, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I just want to rephrase my question to try and get an answer. Sorry. What would be ingredients that would be toxic if in higher doses? If you can name maybe just a few, I'm sure there's maybe a potential huge amount, but if you can cite 5.
Representative, you could argue that nitrogen that we breathe every day, oxygen we breathe in higher doses, it can be toxic, etc. So that's an open-ended question, and again, it's one of the criteria that I went through. Unfortunately, it falls into the criteria of sort of impossible expectation category of how information is processed in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. One last question for you, Doctor. Thank you for your indulgence. We've heard testimony previously that in terms of the presence of human fetal cell, that there hasn't been any new fetal cells introduced in decades, and it is not used in very many vaccines at this point. But I've been confronted with some information that suggests that even the mere presence of fetal cells can lead to insertional mutagenesis or autoimmune disease, whereby the cells are the fetal cells are attacking the immune system of the individual. Can you please comment on those?
Look, as I said, like there's 5-6 categories of how information is processed, and unfortunately, you guys have to sort of confront all of that. And I'm glad you mentioned that includes these kinds of hypotheses that are not mainstream and that have been looked at through group consensus, not by individual Google and PubMed searchers, but actual scientific consensus by folks who are vetted for conflict of interest, who are vetted for their scientific credentials, and bring interdisciplinary focus and expertise to these kinds of discussions. Based on that, this is not one of the concerns that these entities like the National Academy of Medicine, which previously called the Institute of Medicine, has found to be of a concern that would alter their recommendation for vaccines being safe, etc.
Well, thank you. As you can see, we committee members will struggle with trying to differentiate between claims and assertions, all based upon information that's presented from a variety of sources. And our objective is to listen to everyone, but hopefully by the end of this process, be somewhat discriminating on what is scientifically supported and what isn't. Are there any other questions? If not, Doctor, thank you for your time. We're going to return to the public. We're going to give one last shot to James and Kristen Turcos. Are they actually here?
Yes.
Yes, great. Come on up. We're not going to constrain your time. You have up to 6 minutes between you. Find that up.
My name is James Turcos. I live in Woodbridge. I don't have a bunch of fancy initials after my name, but like you said, you're hearing from everybody. I'm just a father. I work in healthcare IT. And I'm here to strongly voice opposition to HB 5044, an act concerning the removal of parental choice and constitutional rights. I have 2 kids, one in 2nd grade, one who we hope to start kindergarten this fall. We have a 3rd on the way. But instead of just eagerly anticipating that, we've been spending all our free time agonizing over this whole situation. And this will have a greater direct negative impact on more Connecticut citizens than probably any other potential bill in recent memory, because it hits a lot of people at home. People are scared. It may have impact on public health, positive or negative. We don't really know that yet. But it will have consequences which are certain. It will turn a lot of lives upside down. Those who don't comply could be denied education, segregated from their peers. Others will feel forced to leave the state of Connecticut. And a lot of families that might be most victimized could be the low to middle income, dual income, single parent. Some of them may have no choice, and they'll feel forced to avoid financial ruin and other upheaval. I don't know how many families will fall into each of those categories. I don't know if any of you know that either at this point, but it's been stressful the last few months for a lot of people, including us, and no one should have to make those choices in America. Other things worth mentioning, the medical exemption, we've talked about this advisory committee. We don't know what's going to happen with the doctor-patient relationship on that. California's experience hasn't been very good so far in that area. Implementation and enforcement is going to cost money. This isn't free. This isn't just a magic button where everything gets better. For those forced to comply, 15 or 16 shots in the catch-up schedule, it's more than I've had my entire life, and I was fully vaccinated. A lot of people are concerned about that. And most have even admitted it's no emergency. We're trying to get out in front of it. We're trying to make sure we prevent an emergency. But holding the education hostage of many thousands of students is, as a purely preventative measure, should be the last resort, not the first resort. And it requires an overwhelming burden of proof to do something like that. And I've seen a lot of half-truths that may not have all the proper context, a lot of fear-mongering actually as well. And the 25% increase cited in the DPH data is a misleading statistic. And we ended up with one extra kindergartner with an exemption versus the previous year for every 5 to 6 schools. That doesn't sound like an emergency to me. And we actually heard today that it actually ticks a little bit back down from last year. We're told to ignore that. It doesn't matter. It's just noise. But we don't know that yet. So this bill will do far more harm than good to Connecticut families and the state as a whole, I strongly feel, and I urge opposition from everyone for HB 5044 and stand in favor of constitutional and God-given rights of every Connecticut citizen. Thank you.
My name is Kristen Turkos. I live in Woodbridge, Connecticut. I sit before you all today as a public school educator for the past 14 years who deeply believes that all children are entitled to an education without discrimination. HB 5044 discriminates against healthy children with a religious exemption. As a professional educator, it is my commitment to honor and follow the Connecticut Code of Professional Responsibility for Teachers, first and foremost in my responsibility to all students. Quote, the professional teacher, in full recognition of his or her obligation to the student, shall nurture in students lifelong respect and compassion for themselves and other human beings, regardless of race, ethnic origin, gender, social class, disability, religion, or sexual orientation, unquote. This policy not only discriminates against students based on religion, but also on social class. The bill victimizes lower and middle income families, most of whom do not have the financial means to uproot their families and leave the state or to homeschool. Some will be forced to violate their sincerely held religious beliefs to avoid devastating personal and financial hardship. Others will have their children thrown out of school and into an uncertain future. This is extremely un-American. If enacted, this legislation will ruin lives. There is no public health emergency or threat of any kind in Connecticut to warrant such extreme legislation. These healthy children with religious exemptions have thrived in Connecticut schools for the entire 60 years that the exemption has been in place. These children are not a threat. A child with a high nighttime fever who is pumped full of Tylenol and sent to school the next day is certainly more dangerous to the immunocompromised than a healthy, unvaccinated, or partially vaccinated child. So are children sent to school with various other ailments for which there is no vaccine, such as the common cold or strep throat. I also sit before you as a mother, profoundly concerned that she may no longer be able to make choices for her own children. I would like to share an assignment that my son recently completed for Martin Luther King Jr. today. He was asked to draw a picture and write about a dream that would make the world a better place. My 7-year-old wrote, "My dream for the world is for kids to not fight. It would make the world a better place because nobody would get hurt." When he came home from school with the worksheet, I asked him if he was really concerned about kids fighting in school in 2nd grade. He replied, "No, Mommy, I just made that up. I didn't want to talk about vaccines in school, but my real dream is for all kids to go to school, even if they don't get shots." Thank you.
Okay, if we hear the applause again, we'll have to have you escorted from the room. I'm sorry. I know you fully appreciate the testimony. I think many of the people here in this committee feel as well, but we cannot tolerate any response from the audience. I want to thank you both. Just to clarify one point, when it comes to the catch-up schedule, a medical exemption by a practitioner could include coming to terms on a more appropriate catch-up schedule necessarily. So it doesn't mean that you have to be total compliance